What if I told you that history didn't forget you, it erased you? Not because you were insignificant, but because you were chosen, because your name once echoed through the desert winds, because your blood once carried covenant, because your ancestors weren't slaves by nature, they were exiles by prophecy. This isn't just a story about black people in the Bible. This is a forbidden map, burned, buried, rewritten to keep you from finding your way home. What if the 12 tribes of Israel never vanished? What if they were scattered, renamed, chained, and shipped across oceans? What if the curses written in Deuteronomy weren't distant warnings to another people, but a mirror of your past? What if your story didn't start on a slave ship, but in a covenant made under stars? Tonight we won't just ask questions. We'll uncover records, lost names, stolen legacies, ancient languages buried in African tongues, holy rituals still surviving in shadows of forgotten villages. This is not mythology. This is not rebellion. This is scripture. Scripture they didn't want you to see, and once you see it, you'll never see yourself the same again. So, who told you that you were lost? Because the truth is, you were never lost. You were just hidden. And today we begin the search. Part 1. The original promise, the covenant with Abraham. Before there was a land, before there was a temple, before there was even a people called Israel, there was a whisper in the desert. One man, one voice, one promise. His name was Abram, not yet Abraham. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a warrior. He was a wanderer, a man with no children, no territory, no claim to power. And yet God chose him. But why not for what he had? Confined to borders on a map or titles on documents. It was about bloodlines and belief. It was about a people chosen to carry something sacred, even if they didn't always know it. In Genesis 15, God leads Abram outside and says, "Look toward heaven, count the stars if you are able." Then he said, "So shall your descendants be." He wasn't pointing at sand, he was pointing at galaxies. This was not a tribal agreement. It was a celestial assignment. Now stay with me, because this is where the world got confused. Over time, people began to believe that Israel was just a modern nation or a particular ethnicity or a passport. But biblically, Israel was born long before any country existed. Israel wasn't a place, it was a person. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, who wrestled with God and was renamed Israel, one who contends with God. And from him came 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 branches of a tree that would one day stretch across continents. But not all 12 tribes remained in one place. Not all 12 stayed visible. Some would be scattered, hidden, renamed, captured, forgotten by men, but not by God. And here's what changes everything. The covenant never expired. It wasn't a political treaty. It wasn't dependent on a priesthood or a perfect performance. It was a divine oath. In Genesis 17, God says to Abraham, "I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant." Everlasting. That means eternal, unbreakable, unfading. Even if they wandered, even if they were enslaved, even if the world tried to erase their name, God's promise was not canceled by exile, it was activated by it. Which brings us to the question that no one dares ask: if the covenant is everlasting, Then where are Abraham's children today? Not just spiritually, not metaphorically, but literally. Bloodline, culture, memory. Because according to Scripture, they would still exist. They would still be somewhere. They may not look like how we imagine Israelites from Renaissance paintings. They may not live in the places you'd expect. But the covenant didn't require them to. The covenant required only that they survive, that they carry the echo of a promise even if no one ever told them where it came from. Maybe they'd still keep the Sabbath without knowing why. Maybe they'd circumcise on the 8th day because it's tradition. Maybe they'd sing in tones strangely similar to ancient Hebrew melodies. Maybe they would carry the signs but not the name. Maybe they're watching this right now, because the covenant is not a myth. It is a thread, and it stretches from Abraham's tent through slavery, exile, colonialism, and silence all the way to you. And that's why this story isn't just history, it's identity. You're not just watching to learn, you're watching to remember. Because what was promised to Abraham is still pulsing in the blood of his descendants. And if you've ever felt a stirring, a longing, if you've ever asked, where do I belong? Then maybe the answer is older than you think. Because maybe the stars Abraham saw that night were meant to reflect you. But if the promise was eternal, why did the 12 tribes vanish? Why were they scattered? And where did they go? The next chapter holds the first great disappearance and the first step in the cover-up. Don't look away, we're just getting started. Part 2, the scattering. How the tribes were erased. So if the covenant with Abraham was everlasting, if the bloodline still had purpose, then how did the tribes vanish? Or more accurately, who made them disappear? Let's go back. Not to Europe, not to modern borders, but to the ancient cradle of prophecy. To understand the scattering, we must first understand the warnings, because long before the tribes were scattered, they were foretold they would be. In Deuteronomy 28, a chapter often read lightly, rarely understood deeply, Moses doesn't just bless Israel for obedience. He lays out a detailed prophecy of consequences for forgetting the covenant. And one line in particular rings across centuries with terrifying precision. And the Lord shall bring you into Egypt again with ships, and there you shall be sold to your enemies as male and female slaves. Egypt, ships, slavery, silence. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't poetic. This was a roadmap. And history followed it exactly. Let's begin with Assyria 722 BC. 10 of the 12 tribes known as the Northern Kingdom were conquered, uprooted, and dispersed across the empire. Families split, languages erased, identities rewritten. The Assyrian policy was deliberate: remove a people from their land, and they'll forget who they are. Then came Babylon, 586 BC. The southern kingdom, Judah, was taken next. Jerusalem fell, the temple was burned, the ark disappeared. But worse than the destruction was the displacement. Because when you remove a people from their place, you also try to remove them from their promise. But the Bible never said the people would be lost. It said they would be scattered. Isaiah 11 speaks of it. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Scattered, not destroyed, hidden, not forgotten. So where did they go? Some stayed in Babylon. Others fled east-south, but many went into Africa, not as tourists, not as conquerors, as refugees of a spiritual war. Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, regions that appear again and again in Scripture, became places of both exile and preservation. In fact, even Jesus as a child fled to Egypt. Why? Because Africa was not foreign to Israel. It was home in exile. But exile didn't end there. Over the next 1,000 years, generation after generation of Israelites found themselves pushed deeper into Africa, both by war and by the slow erosion of identity. until eventually many of them no longer remembered they were Israelites. But prophecy did, because Deuteronomy 28 didn't stop with Babylon. It spoke of another bondage, one far from Canaan, far from Egypt, and far more systematic. And the Lord shall scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And among these nations you shall find no rest, but only a trembling heart, failing eyes, and a despairing soul. Now pause. Look at the transatlantic slave trade, 16th to 19th century. Tens of millions of Africans captured, but not just any Africans. Many came from regions historically tied to Hebrew customs. West Africa, places like Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, where ancient communities practiced circumcision on the 8th day, kept Sabbath, avoided unclean foods, and used names with undeniable Hebrew etymology. These weren't coincidences, they were remnants. And then came the ships, steel chains, muzzles, whips, branding irons, languages banned, lineages erased. Men who once called on Yahweh were taught to call themselves nothing. The prophecy was fulfilled not just spiritually, but historically, geographically, and physically. You will serve your enemies in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and poverty. You will be an astonishment, a byword, a proverb among all nations. And again, not metaphor. African slaves were given new names, treated as subhuman, and turned into bywords. Let that settle. A byword. That's not oppression by accident. That's erasure by design. Now you might say, but aren't we spiritual Israel now? Yes, faith welcomes all who believe, but don't forget the original seed still matters, because God never breaks a covenant. And he said to Abraham, your descendants shall be as the stars, not vanish, not be absorbed, but continue, even in chains, even in silence. So why is this not taught? Why do modern maps forget where Judah once lived in West Africa? Why is Deuteronomy 28 spiritualized when history screams its literal fulfillment? Because if the world knew who the black descendants of slaves truly were, it would have to answer for what it did to God's chosen. That's not guilt-tripping, that's just scripture and history, and the story that was supposed to be forgotten. But what if the curses were just the beginning? Because next we'll explore the shocking question no one dares ask, who actually lived those curses down to every last word. And once you see the parallels, you'll never be able to unsee them. Part 3. Who really lived the curse? We've read the curses in Deuteronomy 28. We've seen the prophecies about ships, slavery, sorrow. But here's the question no one ever seems willing to answer. Who actually lived it? Not symbolically, not spiritually, literally. Because if Scripture is true, and if Deuteronomy is more than metaphor, then someone somewhere in history had to live those exact words. Let's walk through them slowly. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the field. For centuries, black people have been trapped in ghettos, redlined in cities, exploited in rural plantations, cursed wherever they were placed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed. Families ripped apart, children sold away, generations separated so completely that last names meant nothing, lineages erased in a single auction block. Your sons and daughters will be given to another people, and your eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long. That isn't poetry. That is a slave mother in Virginia watching her child sold to Louisiana, never to be seen again. You will be the tail and not the head. Who else globally has been historically positioned last in society's systems? You shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all nations. The words still echo today. The stereotypes, the slurs, the racial slanders that travel across oceans and borders, rooted in systems designed to dehumanize descendants of slaves. And then, the most chilling line of all, the Lord shall bring you into Egypt again with ships. Now, for clarity, Egypt in the Bible doesn't always mean the country. It often symbolizes bondage, oppression, forced labor. And how would they return with ships? That's not how Israel entered Egypt in Exodus. They walked in. But here Moses prophesies something new. a bondage so far so brutal that the only way to reach it would be through transoceanic transport. Centuries later, what do we see? Black bodies crammed beneath deck, shackled in darkness, crossing waters not to a promised land, but to sugar plantations, cotton fields, and colonial mines. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a crime against humanity, it was a fulfillment of prophecy. And here's the twist most will never say aloud. What if these weren't just curses? What if they were clues? What if they were never meant to condemn but to identify? We've been taught to see these verses as judgments, signs of rejection, divine punishment. But what if they were the fingerprints of a forgotten bloodline? Because only one group, one specific people matches every single line. Not vaguely, perfectly. Who else had their language stripped away? Their Hebrew names replaced with English slave names, their spiritual practices banned, their Sabbath forgotten, their heritage demonized. Who else was taught they were cursed by God simply for existing? You see, that's the trick of history. Not just to hurt you, but to convince you the pain was your fault, that your suffering meant abandonment, that your chains were proof of divine rejection. But what if the opposite is true? What if the suffering was not a curse, but a confirmation? Because God warned his people, if you turn from the covenant, these things will happen. Not to strangers, not to outsiders, to his own. And the fact that this story, this exact narrative has played out in the lives of black people around the world is not coincidence. It's continuity. The covenant wasn't revoked, it was real. And the consequences, like the promises, were passed down. But don't miss the hope in the midst of the horror, because the curses were never meant to be the end. They were a path back, a call to remembrance, even in exile, even in chains. God never forgot the children of Abraham. Isaiah 49 says, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. You may have forgotten your name, but he hasn't. You may have forgotten your language, your land, your lineage, but he hasn't." What the world called a curse, God calls a reminder. And here's the danger of this truth. Because if black people across the world, descendants of slaves, sons and daughters of diaspora, are actually the scattered tribes of Israel, then history must answer. Then the world's greatest lie is exposed. Because these weren't just slaves, they were the children of a covenant. And what was taken from them, their names, their stories, their dignity must be reckoned with. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about finding the divine thread hidden in your own pain, the sacred identity beneath the scars. Because the curses may explain your history, but they don't define your destiny. And if all this is true, then wouldn't there still be evidence, traces of Hebrew identity hidden in the lands where these people were taken from? In the next part, we'll uncover real African tribes, still practicing Hebrew customs, even after centuries of separation. And what we find will leave no doubt that Israel never vanished. It just went home in disguise. Part 4, Hebrew in Africa, Echoes from the Ashes. What if I told you the tribes were never truly lost? What if they were simply hiding in plain sight because while history tried to bury the identity of Israel's scattered children, something survived? Not in books, but in rituals. Not in temples, but in tradition. Not in Hebrew script, but in the bones of African villages. The fire of exile didn't burn everything. Some embers, smoldering silent, kept glowing through the ashes of time. And when we follow them, they lead us back to places most Bible maps never mention. Let's begin with the highlands of Ethiopia. There for over 2,000 years, a distinct community has lived not as Christians, not as Muslims, but as Jews. They're known today as Beta Israel, the House of Israel. They observe the Sabbath not on Sunday, but from Friday evening to Saturday sunset, just as Torah commands. They practice circumcision on the 8th day, just like Abraham. They celebrate Passover not with matzah from Europe, but with traditional unleavened bread baked in clay ovens. They slaughter animals ritually draining the blood according to Leviticus. They separate milk from meat, abstain from pork and shellfish, and follow dietary laws not because they converted, but because they always were. And here's what's truly astonishing. For centuries, Beta Israel had never read the modern Talmud. They didn't practice rabbinic Judaism. They followed the Old Testament, the Torah directly passed down through oral memory and handwritten scrolls. Why? Because their tradition predates European Jewish influence. In 1973, the Chief Rabbinate of Israel formally recognized them as descendants of the lost tribes, but the world barely noticed. Now journey westward across the continent to the heart of Nigeria, to a people called the Igbo. You may know them for their resilience, their language, their music, but what most don't know is that many Igbo elders believe they are descendants of Gad, Zebulun, and Manasseh, 3 of the 12 tribes. Their oral histories speak of crossing rivers under divine guidance. Their customs include circumcision on the 8th day, wearing fringes, tzitzit on garments, observing purification rituals after childbirth or death, sacrificing animals during holy seasons long before colonial missionaries arrived. In fact, some early European explorers were baffled. They wrote in journals of meeting African tribes who follow the laws of Moses. But instead of recognizing it, they erased it. They called it superstition. They called it myth. Because if Africa held Israel's remnants, the entire narrative of Western religious dominance would fracture. And then there's Sierra Leone, where among the Limba people, similar echoes still ring. The Limba have no written script of their own, but their practices carry uncanny parallels to Torah commandments. They honor one creator God whose name bears striking similarity to Elohim. They keep ritual purity laws, isolate women during menstruation, and emphasize bloodline ancestry just as Numbers and Leviticus instruct. Anthropologists once dismissed this as coincidence. But how many coincidences must stack up before you start asking different questions? You see, cultures don't preserve complex rituals for centuries by accident, especially not across thousands of miles from Ethiopia to West Africa, unless those rituals come from a shared source. And now, recent genetic studies are beginning to catch up with what oral history never forgot. DNA analysis has shown that Beta Israel share markers with ancient Semitic populations. Some Igbo lineages display Y chromosome links to the Middle East. And across various African Jewish communities, linguistic connections have been found. Words like Eloah Shabbat, Yisrael embedded in tribal languages. But this goes beyond genetics. It goes to spiritual memory. Because sometimes the body forgets, but the soul remembers. These communities didn't read Deuteronomy 28 and decide to imitate it. They lived it before they ever knew it had been written. And here's what the colonizers never expected, that the descendants of Israel's covenant would still be lighting candles in mud huts, still blowing horns made from ram's horns, still blessing children under stars as Abraham once did. These practices survived despite slavery, despite forced conversion, despite cultural erasure, because you can beat a people, rename them, exile them, but you cannot erase what God remembers. And maybe that's the real mystery, that the farther the tribes were scattered, the more their roots spread beneath the surface like seeds waiting for rain. And now those seeds are waking up. But language never lies. And if these tribes are truly remnants of ancient Israel, then the proof won't just be in rituals, it will be in the very words they speak. In the next part, we'll uncover how Hebrew lives on inside African tongues, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. Because sometimes, your mouth remembers what your mind forgot. Part 5. Language never lies. Hebrew and Yoruba. History can be rewritten, books can be banned, bloodlines can be denied, but language never lies. Because the tongue holds memory. It hides clues in syllables and rhythm, in sacred repetition passed from mother to child. You can erase a name, but you cannot erase the words that raised a people. So if the tribes of Israel truly scattered into Africa, shouldn't we still hear echoes of Hebrew somewhere in the land? Let's listen. We begin in Yoruba land, the homeland of the Yoruba people, one of the most influential cultures in West Africa, stretching through modern-day Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. At first glance, Yoruba seems like any other African language, tonal, musical, ancient. But look closer and you'll start to hear something older, something strangely familiar. For example, the Yoruba term for Sunday is Oho Aiku, literally translated, the day that cannot die. Stop and think. What other tradition calls the seventh day holy, set apart from death and labor? In the Hebrew worldview, Shabbat, the Sabbath, is not just a rest day. It's the day that connects man to the divine, the day that death cannot enter because it belongs to eternity. So when the Yoruba say Oho Aiku, they're not just naming a day, they're describing a theological concept rooted in Genesis. Coincidence? Let's keep listening. In Yoruba, the name for the creator is Olodumare, the supreme being, the one above all Orisha's spirits. Yet many Yoruba prayers also refer to Eledumare or Orunmila, divine attributes that reflect the multifaceted oneness of God. In ancient Hebrew, God is called Elohim, a plural form denoting majesty, unity in complexity. Different names, same structure, one essence, many titles. Both traditions affirm a singular creator whose name carries layers of mystery. Now consider ritual law. In Yoruba tradition, certain animals are forbidden for sacrifice. There are taboos against mixing blood with milk. Specific days are considered unclean or set apart, just like in Leviticus. The concept of Ise in Yoruba impurity or wrongdoing is not simply social misbehavior, but a spiritual breach requiring purification, and sometimes even atonement through blood. Sound familiar? In Torah, sin chatat is not just moral, it has spiritual weight. It requires restitution, purification, a covering. And both traditions link cleansing with ritual time, because the Yoruba calendar, like the Hebrew calendar, is lunar-based. Festivals and rites are often timed by the new moon, by 7-day intervals, or by agricultural seasons that match the biblical feast cycles. How no missionaries taught this. No Torah scrolls were passed to these remote regions. These patterns were preserved not by scholars, but by farmers, elders, storytellers, priests, who didn't even know they were echoing scripture. And it doesn't stop with structure. Many actual words in Yoruba mirror those in Hebrew. Baba, il's father, same in both languages. Omo, il child, compare with Am people in Hebrew as in Am Yisrael. Ifa, il's hidden knowledge, echoes the root yada in Hebrew meaning to know deeply. Even the traditional Yoruba name Yeshua appears not always referring to Jesus, but still pronounced exactly as the Hebrew name for the Messiah. And then there's this. The Yoruba naming system uses meaning-rich prophetic names, names that declare purpose, identity, or divine appointment. In the Bible, names were never random. They carried destiny. Isaac, he laughs. Samuel, God heard. Jacob, he grasps the heel. In Yoruba, you'll find names like Ifedayo, love has become joy. Temidayo, mine has turned to joy. Oluwasan, the Lord has done well. Names in both cultures are not labels, they are declarations. So again, is all this a coincidence? Or are we listening to a language birthed near Sinai, still whispered in the hills of Africa? And here's the twist. Even after centuries of colonization, even after forced conversions and missionary schools, the Yoruba still preserve this pattern. Because it was never learned, it was remembered. Their words are not inventions, they are resonances, unintentional witnesses to a forgotten identity. Because you can silence a people, you can burn their books, but if the covenant runs through their breath, it will speak, and it's speaking now. The language says what history tried to hide, that these are not just African traditions. They are Hebrew footprints preserved in the soil of Africa. And maybe, just maybe, if we follow the language, it will lead us home. But if this is true, If Hebrew still lives in African tongues, then the next question is dangerous. Why was it hidden in the first place? In the next part, we uncover the system, religious, political, and global, that worked for centuries to erase this truth. And trust me, they didn't just rewrite maps, they rewrote God. Part 6. Who erased the truth? If the truth was scattered, if the bloodline survived, if the language still whispers from African tongues, then one haunting question remains: who erased the truth? Because stories don't vanish on their own. Maps don't redraw themselves. Identities don't dissolve unless someone or something erased them. Let's go back. The earliest followers of Jesus were Middle Eastern Semitic Hebrew-speaking people. They prayed in synagogues, kept the Sabbath, celebrated Passover, and believed in Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They didn't look like medieval monks. They didn't speak Latin. They didn't picture a blonde Messiah. But within just a few centuries, something changed. As Christianity spread into the Roman Empire, it began to shed its Hebrew roots, not by accident but by design. In 325 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, the Roman Church under Constantine began formalizing doctrine. They outlawed the celebration of Passover in favor of Easter. They replaced Sabbath with Sunday worship. They systematically severed ties with the Jewish calendar, Jewish names, and Jewish customs. Why? Because to make Christianity palatable to the empire, they had to make it Roman. They had to make it white. And this was just the beginning. Fast forward to the age of colonization. European empires, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, Belgium, began carving up Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. And what did they bring with them? Guns, chains, flags, and a Bible translated and weaponized. But not the full Bible, not the Hebrew worldview, not the culture of covenant. They brought a sanitized version stripped of its Semitic origin, wrapped in gold leaf and painted with pale faces. Imagine this. You're an African child in 1700s Jamaica. You're told that God looks like your oppressor, that Moses, who once led slaves to freedom, is now a blue-eyed prince, that Jesus, born in the Middle East, somehow looks like a Dutch oil painting. And then you're told to forget your own language, your own holy days, your own songs. You're baptized not into truth, but into amnesia. This wasn't just spiritual conversion, it was cultural erasure. Hebrew customs, once the heartbeat of God's people, were now labeled pagan if practiced by black communities. Sabbath keeping outlawed, circumcision mocked, fasting on Yom Kippur forbidden, wearing fringes, blowing shofars, avoiding unclean foods, punished. In many slave plantations, even owning a Bible in African hands was illegal, because the fear wasn't religion, it was remembrance. Because if the descendants of slaves ever realized who they were, the illusion would break. And so came the images. The famous Renaissance paintings by Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci weren't just artistic expression, they were theological propaganda. Moses suddenly has porcelain skin. David becomes a European shepherd boy. Jesus is no longer a brown-skinned rabbi, but a flowing-haired European idol. These images didn't just shape art, they shaped belief. For centuries, generations of colonized people in Africa, the Caribbean, America grew up believing that God didn't look like them, that holiness had a skin tone, that salvation had an accent. And here's the twist that hits deepest Christianity: the faith born from a covenant made with a Middle Eastern people was transformed into a system used to erase that very people. The gospel was flipped. Not the last shall be first, but the last shall stay last. But Scripture never agreed with this lie, because even as Europe repainted the prophets, God remembered the remnant. Isaiah 44:5 says, "One shall say, I am the Lord's, another shall call himself by the name of Jacob, and another shall write with his hand the Lord's, and name himself by the name of Israel." You see, no matter how much history tried to silence the truth, the Spirit kept whispering. In back alleys of Harlem, in dusty villages of Nigeria, in the fire songs of enslaved souls across Georgia cotton fields. The name Yahweh still echoed. The hunger for Zion still burned. And slowly, one heart at a time, the memory began returning. Because the gospel is not a weapon, it's not a tool of empire, it is a call to restoration, and the truth always rises even after centuries of suppression. But if they erased the people, could they also erase the places? In the next part, we'll open ancient maps and archaeological records that point to something shocking, that even on colonial charts, the name Judah still survived in West Africa. They tried to rewrite the story, but the land remembers. Part 7. When stones speak maps and artifacts, stories can be hidden, languages can be silenced, people can be renamed, but stones never forget. They do not flatter kings, they do not obey empires, they simply endure, and when the time is right, they speak. And when we listen to the land itself, to ancient maps, carved relics, sacred structures, we discover something that shakes the very foundation of what we thought we knew. Let's begin, not with theology, but with geography. Open a map of West Africa, not a modern one, not the politically redrawn post-colonial patchwork, but a map from the early 1700s published in Europe, created by explorers, traders, and colonial cartographers. They are just above the Gulf of Guinea, nestled near the coasts of what we now call Ghana, Benin, and Nigeria. You'll find a label that has no business being there, at least according to the official narrative, the Kingdom of Judah. Sometimes written Wida or a Judah, but the core root, Judah. Pause. Let that settle. A European colonial map drawn by outsiders labeled a region in West Africa as the Kingdom of Judah. Not metaphor, not suggestion, literal ink on parchment, a name they didn't invent but heard from the people already living there. Why would such a name exist in Africa unless the descendants of the house of Judah, scattered by war, empire, and exile, had replanted themselves there? But it gets deeper, because maps are just the beginning. Now let's walk into the earth itself. In southeastern Nigeria, archaeologists have uncovered ancient stone tablets, not from Europe, not from Egypt, but from the heart of African soil. Etched into these stones, pictographs, linear symbols, and Hebrew letters. Not just random scratches, but intentional inscriptions, some resembling the Tetragrammaton YHWH, the sacred name of God in Hebrew. Some scholars try to explain it away. They say these were marks of coincidence, but the patterns match ancient Semitic script, the kind found in early Israelite settlements. Why would those characters exist in West Africa? Unless those who knew them had once called Zion home in Ghana. Oral tradition speaks of a sacred wooden structure passed down from generation to generation, kept hidden, guarded, a synagogue without knowing the word, inside relics, items used for ritual washing, candlestick holders, shofar-like horns, and a scroll case carved from native wood, aged and cracked, yet still bearing the form of ancient Torah holders. Then there are the bronze vessels found across West African coasts, many used for animal sacrifices. Engraved on the base of several pieces, symbols nearly identical to the menorah, the Lion of Judah, and again the sacred name YHWH. And here's what's wild. None of these artifacts were influenced by modern Israel. They weren't imported. They predate missionary contact. They existed before colonialism began its cultural reprogramming. This wasn't imitation. It was preservation. Now let's talk burial customs. Among the Igbo and Yoruba, certain burial rites mirror those of ancient Hebrews. The covering of mirrors during mourning, the 7-day period of intense grief, the placement of stones, not flowers, at grave sites, the gathering of bones after decay, a practice recorded in the Old Testament. Even the architecture of some ancestral shrines, rectangular east-facing, guarded by stone pillars, echo the dimensions of the tabernacle. Coincidence after coincidence. Or is it something else? Because while the Western world demanded proof in texts, Africa preserved her evidence in ritual, in wood, in iron, and in dust. These weren't Jewish tourists. These weren't European implants. These were indigenous people practicing a faith, speaking a language, burying their dead, and engraving the name of their God, just like their forefathers did in Israel. And while Europe told them to forget, while colonizers tried to burn their names, the stones refused to lie. Psalm 85:11 says, "Truth shall spring out of the earth." And it has. Not in the museums of Paris, not in the palaces of London, but in the hidden corners of Africa, where the covenant was buried but never broken. And now, as prophecy awakens, the earth itself rises to testify. The maps remember, the stones remember, the artifacts remember, and maybe, so do you. But what if the land wasn't the only witness? What if the worship of Yahweh, the name of the God of Israel, had already existed in Africa long before missionaries arrived? In the next part, we reveal ancient African tribes who knew the name Yahweh, even before Moses spoke it from the burning bush. This changes everything. Part 8. Before Israel, the forgotten worshippers of Yahweh. We've traced the bloodlines, we've followed the rituals, we've heard the language, we've seen the stones speak. But now, we ask a more ancient question: who first called on the name of Yahweh? If the story began with Abraham, if the covenant started with Israel, then how do we explain what came before? Because buried beneath the pages of Scripture, hidden between verses that most skip over, there lies a truth few dare to explore. Yahweh was known before Israel was ever born. Let's begin with a name: Jethro, the priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moses, the man who welcomed a fugitive shepherd from Egypt into his home. When Moses fled from Pharaoh and found refuge in Midian, he didn't just meet a wise father figure, he met a man who already worshipped Yahweh. Exodus 18 tells us plainly, Jethro, the priest of Midian, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with him before God. And this isn't a generic God, this is YHWH, the covenant name, which means Yahweh was not exclusive to Israel. He had been known and worshipped outside of Abraham's line. And where was Midian? Midian wasn't in Canaan. It was located in northwest Arabia, near the northeastern edges of Africa, deep in territory later inhabited by Black Semitic peoples. This is not a footnote. This is a bombshell, because it means Moses did not introduce Yahweh to the world. He reintroduced him. Now travel back even further past Moses, past Jethro, to the sands of Egypt. In 1887, archaeologists unearthed inscriptions at Soleb, an ancient Egyptian temple built by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC. On the stone walls was a phrase Shasu of YHW. Let's unpack that. The Shasu were a nomadic people living in regions stretching from southern Canaan into northeastern Africa. They were often feared by Egyptians, described as wanderers, herders, and desert dwellers. But here's the shocking part. The inscription links them to YHW, the earliest written form of Yahweh. This is 2 centuries before Moses, before the Exodus, before Sinai, before there was a nation called Israel. The name Yahweh was already carved in stone. So who were these Shasu of YHW? Were they proto-Israelites, descendants of Abraham's forgotten children? Or were they entirely separate peoples, African Semitic tribal, who still knew the same God? The Bible hints at this again and again. Abraham wasn't the only one to receive dreams from God. Job, a man outside of Israel, was called righteous. Melchizedek, a priest of El Elyon, blessed Abraham and was later declared a priest forever. Yahweh was never boxed in by ethnicity. He was never contained by race or border, and yet, over time, he was painted over, Europeanized, nationalized, branded, until we believed that only one narrow line of blood could claim him. But the scriptures say otherwise. Psalm 87:4 declares, I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me, Philistia too, and Tyre along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion. Cush, that's Africa. God says, "This one too is mine." So let's revisit the twist. If Yahweh was known in Midian before Moses, if his name was inscribed in Egypt before Sinai, if African peoples like the Shasu and Cushites worshipped him before the Hebrew nation was even formed, then what does that say about how we've framed God? It says we've made him too small. And more than that, it means that Black and African peoples were never outside of his story. They were part of the original chorus, singing his name long before Rome ever built a church. They didn't learn Yahweh from missionaries. They didn't borrow him from colonial religion. They carried him with them through deserts, through exile, through silence. Because when you're chosen, you don't need paperwork. You just need memory. And even if history forgot them, Yahweh did not. He remembered the ones who whispered his name under the stars. He remembered the shepherds and desert prophets. He remembered the forgotten worshipers. And maybe now, he's calling them to remember him. But what about those outside Israel who were still called righteous? Could it be that God was never just working through one bloodline, but through many voices? In the next part, we'll explore the mysterious figures the Bible calls holy, but who weren't even Israelites, because the covenant is bigger than we thought, and righteousness might not always wear the label we expect. Part 9. The Book of Eli Syndrome. Righteous outsiders. What if everything we thought about belonging to God was too narrow? What if the lines we drew around faith, bloodlines, borders, denominations were lines God never drew? Because the deeper you go into the scriptures, the more you begin to see a pattern that challenges everything religion taught us to assume. Let's call it the Book of Eli Syndrome. You remember the film A Man in a Ruined World carrying the last copy of a sacred book? A book everyone wants, but no one remembers how to read. That's the tragedy of our world too. We've fought over who owns the truth, but forgotten what the truth actually says. Let's start with a man named Job. We've read his story, we know his suffering, but have you ever noticed the most radical part? Job wasn't an Israelite. He didn't come from Abraham's line. He lived outside the covenant nation. And yet God calls him blameless, upright, God-fearing, and shunning evil. Let that sink in. A man with no connection to Jacob, no Torah, no temple, no Levi priest. And yet when God looked at the earth, he saw Job. Why? Because righteousness was never about passport. It was always about posture. Now let's go deeper to one of the most mysterious figures in all of Scripture, Melchizedek. His name means King of Righteousness. He appears in Genesis 14 without introduction, without ancestry. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. He blesses Abraham, and Abraham tithes to him. Stop. Abraham, the father of nations, the chosen one, submits to Melchizedek. Why? Because Melchizedek knew Yahweh before the covenant was even written. Centuries later, the book of Hebrews declares, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." A priest without genealogy. A priest not from Levi. A priest who proves that God's authority can rise outside of the system. And this isn't limited to Job and Melchizedek. Think about Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who feared Yahweh more than the Israelites did. She hid the spies, and in doing so secured her place in the lineage of Messiah. Think about Ruth, a Moabite woman from a cursed nation who clung to Naomi and declared, "Your God shall be my God." She too became part of the bloodline of Christ. These are not marginal characters. They are not theological footnotes. They are central because they remind us God sees the heart. He always has. When the religious world says, "You don't belong," God says, "If you know me, you're already mine." And that's the tragedy of spiritual gatekeeping. We've told people, "You're too late. You're not from the right tribe. You don't have the right name, the right ritual, the right background." But Scripture whispers something more ancient. Yahweh has always walked among outsiders, always heard the cry of the foreigner, always honored faith even when it came from unexpected mouths. In Isaiah 56, God says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, The Lord will surely separate me from his people, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Do you see it? The covenant was never about exclusion, it was about invitation. And in today's world where nations still fight over land identity and heritage, we must remember the most dangerous truth of all. God doesn't need permission to choose someone. He doesn't consult your ancestry. He doesn't wait for your paperwork. He simply looks for those who seek him. And sometimes, those people are found in the very places religion refuses to look. In prison cells, in refugee camps, in tribal forests and broken homes, in the faces of the forgotten. That's the Book of Eli syndrome, the righteous man without a title, the faithful woman without a platform, the pure soul who carries truth not because it was handed to them, but because they held on to it in the dark. So what does this mean for us? It means you don't need anyone's permission to return to Yahweh. You don't need the approval of institutions to walk in righteousness. You just need a heart that knows his voice, a soul that hasn't forgotten his name. Because long before the temple was built, long before the law was written, God was already walking with those who feared him. And he still is. But if righteousness isn't about borders or names, then who are the Black Israelites awakening today? In the next part, we'll explore the modern resurgence as people across the world begin to reclaim the identity they were never supposed to remember, because history tried to bury them, but prophecy is calling them home. Part 10, The Rise. Black Israelites today. For centuries they wandered nameless, mocked, marginalized, misunderstood, told they were cursed, told their history began on slave ships and ended in chains. But now, something is happening. Across cities and coasts, deserts and islands, something ancient is stirring again. Not in books, but in blood. Not in classrooms, but in memory. They call it a movement. But it's not a trend, it's not a rebellion, it's a homecoming. The Black Hebrew Israelites are rising. Not to start something new, but to reclaim something never truly lost. From the bustling streets of Brooklyn, to the crowded neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince, to the river villages of Nigeria and the townships of South Africa, voices are awakening with one message. We are not cursed, we are the covenant. They are reading the scriptures differently now, not as outsiders looking in, but as sons and daughters reclaiming their family's scroll. Deuteronomy 28 isn't a curse anymore, it's a testimony. Isaiah isn't distant poetry, it's a letter addressed to them. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. This awakening is not born of violence, it's born of remembrance. They remember now that the Sabbath is theirs, that the laws of Moses once governed their ancestors, that they once prayed in Hebrew tongues, long before they were taught to kneel in silence to foreign names. And they're not just quoting scripture, they're living it. Communities across the world are restoring ancient customs, wearing fringes on their garments as commanded in Numbers 15, celebrating the feasts of the Lord, Passover tabernacles, trumpets, teaching their children Hebrew names, not slave names, honoring Yahweh not as a foreign deity, but as the God of their fathers. And here's what's radical. They're doing it without permission, without funding, without institutional approval. Because the call isn't coming from a stage, it's coming from the soul. You'll find them in parks, on sidewalks, in basements, on YouTube, in prison cells, in living rooms. They're opening Bibles with trembling hands, pointing to verses they'd read 100 times, but never through the right lens. And when they see it, truly see it, they weep, not just for what was stolen, but for what survived. Because against all odds through slavery, colonization, forced conversion, and cultural erasure, the covenant endured. The DNA of destiny dormant for generations is now pulsing again with divine voltage. And for the first time in centuries, Black men and women are standing tall, not as orphans of history, but as heirs of prophecy. This is not a claim of superiority. It's a recognition of identity. And identity is power. Because when you know who you are, you stop begging the world to tell you. You stop shrinking. You stop apologizing. You stop seeing your skin as a punishment and your past as a shame. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of Yahweh, a God who never forgot you even when you forgot Him. And that's what makes this awakening unstoppable. It's not led by politicians, not by celebrities, not by scholars in ivory towers. It's led by ordinary people, by mothers teaching their children the name Yahweh before they can even spell Jesus, by fathers restoring dignity to broken lineages, by elders who once felt forgotten now walking with heads high, knowing they were always written in. And yes, the world will mock it. Yes, churches will call it heresy. Historians will call it revision. Mainstream media will call it dangerous. But prophecy will call it inevitable. Because the dry bones are rattling again. And as Ezekiel said, "Son of man, can these bones live?" The answer is yes. They are already living. So if you've ever felt displaced, if you've ever felt like history erased your page, if you've ever looked at the Bible and wondered why no one in its pages ever looked like you, you're not alone. This is not just a religious shift. It's a return, not to a denomination, but to a destiny. And the question now is not whether it's real. The question is, are you ready to remember who you really are? And for those of you watching, the elders, the grandparents, the silent ones who carried this truth in your bones long before anyone spoke it aloud, don't go anywhere. Because in the next part, we're speaking directly to you. You who endured, you who survived, you who still believe even when the world forgot you. This next message is yours. You were never just watching history, you lived it. For those who carried silent questions for decades about your worth, your name, your God, this journey isn't just about the past, it's about what still lives in you. The world may have told you that your suffering was a curse, that your culture was primitive, that your prayers were powerless. But Scripture, real Scripture says the opposite. You are the remnant. Not forgotten, not broken, but preserved. You were never meant to blend in. You are meant to remember. Your scars, they are covenant marks. Your wisdom, it's generational survival. Your endurance, that's what prophecy looks like when it's walking. So pass it on. Tell the next generation not just who they are, but whose they are. Because the rediscovery of identity doesn't start in classrooms. It starts in living rooms, in whispered prayers, in stories only elders can tell. And maybe you were the missing piece all along.